for agreeing to meet with me.
Yeah, good morning.
So you were saying,
Well, I was trying to explain to you kind of what I do and where I'm at in terms of the kinds of project management I do. And so I'm part of the Fulton Schools of Engineering Dean's Office, and we're an umbrella group over 6 of the engineering colleges. They all have sustainability in them, but electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, civil engineering, computer information systems, I probably haven't got them all. And then we have different mixes where they're interdisciplinary in nature. And so each set of research has a slightly different set of elements in their laboratories that we have to consider. Even though there are few hoods and different kinds of laboratory setups, you know, civil engineering, for example, they might have a 10,000 ton crusher of some sort or testing load machine, and that would take a special vibration basis and those kinds of elements. And so in addition to the project management, I find that there's not that many project managers in general that are specific to the kinds of research that engineering does.
oh, that's really, so there's kind of like a gap in the experience.
Correct. And so I'm in an unusual position in that I have a lot of background in all different kinds of construction and laboratory background, and I'm an avid learner. And so we have the internet, so I usually get to meet these folks before they come here. They sign a letter of intent, and I start the conversation with them, and then I will go on and read their research papers. I want to know what they're doing, what they're thinking, what's the kind of specialty questions that I might want to ask them to draw out. At the end of the day, I'm trying to build a laboratory or a research space for them that allows them to perform their research. And our people just got a PhD, and they're just starting out as researchers, and they've never even thought about what kind of kitchen they want or what kind of lab. They've just worked in other people's. Right. And so this is their first opportunity, and we, meaning the engineering group, we try to assign a mentor to them to help them through the process. But that hasn't been very fruitful at this point. A lot of times the researcher just kind of gets thrown into our group, and then we try to get lab managers or other people to help them with the kinds of problems that they may encounter as they are working that they'll want to try to avoid during the design process.
And that's fascinating, because there's also, aren't there certain things that they've already specified that they've gotten the funding for in their grant?
Well,
that's
so
going
right.
to go in their lab, but maybe they missed something that's like essential?
It depends on their level. So some people we hire from, I'll use MIT or some research university, and they come here and they're already full tenured professors, and we're happy to have them, and they're doing worldwide research and they're well funded. That's a different person to build a laboratory for than somebody who just graduated, who doesn't have any funding yet, doesn't have any grants, just had a great idea, or maybe they had an unbelievable PhD presentation, a thesis of some sort, a dissertation I should say, and they were hired based on that new knowledge set that we wanted to add to the knowledge base here at the university. So those folks are starting from scratch. They kind of have an idea what they want based on the kind of research they've been doing, but that tends to take us about a year to build a laboratory here. Not that the construction takes that long, but by the time we go through the bureaucratic process of the design and safety protocols and finding the right space and maybe having a domino move where I need to move this person out and somebody else gets moved in, it takes about a year. Well, during that year, they're talking to their colleagues and they're maybe getting new grants. So as we get closer to construction, we have the scope creep of, oh, hey, can we do this? Can we do that? Can we change this? Can we change that? And so, which is perfectly acceptable and normal in what we do, but it's one of the challenges that we face.
Right. And so in this relationship with the researcher, so they're your client, and who are the funding stakeholders then? Because that's like a part of the whole
right. So yeah,
mix
there's a
of
lot
characters,
of
right?
There's a lot of pieces to this puzzle. Well, so generally, but generally I'm dealing with brand new people, and we are renovating a laboratory space. We're changing the metrics of a building to accommodate this person. In a few cases, like with some of our newer buildings that are already pre-set up for research, or fume hoods and exhaust, we don't do as much. So those things might be funded by the department, they might be funded by some grants, but as a general rule, the university provides all the infrastructure necessary for the researcher to perform their duties. And the infrastructure dollars tend to come from bond funds. They can come from other places in the university, but typically, because we're changing and improving the actual facility, we use bond money, which is borrowed money by the university, but it's used to forward our mission, which is to, we have many missions, but one of our missions in engineering, and set by Dr. Crow, the president here, is to improve and increase our research revenue. And so in order to do that, we have to update many of our research facilities to the current needs of the current research that's being done.
So how does that all sort of like get balanced out, like sort of in the mix?
You need to talk to an accounting person.
I mean, no, I meant in terms of not the finance side, but the kind of like the requirements side.
Well, so the requirements are set by a combination of and I don't do a lot of this. I'm more the get it done guy. But at a high level, the dean and each of the departments has a director that does a lot of the hiring. And then through the director and collaboration with the dean's office, they determine what's the startup money that this person needs to get going. What's the approximate infrastructure startup money, and what's the approximate startup money that they need to buy equipment and hire PhD students, and how much space are they going to need for their research, how much for the research team. All of these things have to be figured out prior to even hiring the person. And so that's handled at a high level. By the time I get it, I'm in a collaborative of understanding all of our laboratories and our spaces that we have. I think engineering has 450 laboratories and, I don't know, 3,000 some spaces. Trying to keep a mental inventory of that, so when people get hired, I can say, oh, they would fit well here, they would fit well there, and then I try to produce a list of alternative spaces where they might go. Not necessarily part of my project management position, but part of the position of assisting research and how to get all these folks into a space as soon as we can.
Right, that's definitely, right when you were saying that, I was thinking that's like so not a classic project management kind of role, but because in the project management role in an organization, being involved with this over time, that you're the location where this knowledge has accumulated.
Yes, correct. Yeah. And of course, I think that the university in general could do better with legacy documents, which we don't seem to keep. I think that maybe that's why we're so innovative. We don't hold on to the past, but at the same time, there's a certain downside to that. You know, everything has pluses and minuses. Yeah. So, you know, the director that I worked underneath, who had been here 20 years, retired, but along with him retired all the knowledge of air conditioning systems and problems we'd had with buildings and solutions that we'd come up with, and that just disappeared. And so, you know, I've had to come up to speed over the last 4 or 5 years, which is all I've been here, to, you know, make my own mental inventory. Now I've process.
Right. I'm so glad you said, like, you mentioned that you are their client, because that project managers are always in, you know, they're in interrelationships with lots of other people that are all coming together collaboratively. It may be at different time, you know, the timing can be impacted too, but the long gone are the days where you just, like, one project manager did everything and everything for a project, because this always happens where the individual who's serving as project manager has a client, more than one often at one time, but is also the client of other components that are working together.
I totally agree with that. I think there's a leadership lesson about who's on your molecule. We are constantly about relationships, not only with the contractors have different project managers and superintendents, and as you probably know, you have an A team and an F team, you know, and everything in between depending on the amount of experience. And so one of the things that we're always looking for is how difficult, if there's a degree of difficulty on a specific job, is this, and what kind of team do we need? And unfortunately, you have to understand too that the contractor's there to make money. Yeah. And so he doesn't want to put his high dollar guy on a low dollar job. So even though it may, many of our jobs are very high technical knowledge, but there's not as much money. They're typically under $1 million. And so that's something we're always kind of trying to work out with the contractor. And it's the same with the project managers from the capital project management. While they're all very experienced and they work on all 4 campuses and they do a lot of projects, there are some that are more experienced in laboratories than others, and some that are more, they each bring their own specialty. So you might have a mechanical engineer, one guy might be an architect, another guy might be an electrical engineer, or a previous contractor. So from the project manager position that I'm in, I'm always working with multiple levels of knowledge, experience, and what I'm going to call passion. I think if you have a passion to learn and a passion to do a good job, I'd rather have one of those guys, or women, could be both, yeah, working, because they're going to figure it out. They're going to invest the time, versus somebody, they're like, yeah, okay, it's another job.
Right. I'm just putting in my hours and whatever.
Right.
If there's going to be problems, I'll deal with that.
Right.
That'll just add more because it's a cost plus fixed fee, and I'll just keep working some more hours, and we'll make some more money.
Right.
I'm being a little cynical here, but
no, that's right. Well, right, you're always at the behest of the lowest level of person who's on your project.
Yes. Yes. Yes, that's that like weakest link kind
right,
of right. And it sounded, I had an image kind of in my mind when you were talking about like where you're willing to draw the line, and sometimes like that line of learning, so to speak, of like, okay, like am I willing to move it this way or move it that way, and allow for less experience or less skill, but that means I have to have that on my team then. And that's right, something, you can't just be rigid and think every relationship that I'm gonna have is I'm gonna do this and I'm only gonna move up to this line and they're gonna have to come up there and meet me. What you're talking about right, is an acceptance and a strategy for understanding that to contribute to the success of the whole total project, you have to allow that line to fluctuate.
Okay, so now you're impinging on my philosophy from project management. I came out of I was a water polo coach for 20-some years and coached Little League and those things, and I see project management as coaching. So you're describing the difference between micromanaging somebody and leading them, and then how do you coach the team to the best result? So my philosophy is to coach the team. Just because you got a rock star doesn't mean he does everything, because you also want to mentor the other people. If I try not to have too many people that need mentoring on each job, but if it's a superintendent, or if it's a project manager, or if it's a materials supplier that hasn't done business with us, the idea is to continue to, none of us started out knowing everything. So you want to have relationships that are you're being mentored by people who know more. I have lunch once a month with the mechanical engineer on campus. That's one of my weaker areas, and he mentors me on mechanical engineering, and I keep a list of questions, and that's how I get mentored in that area. I have leadership mentoring, working on a master's in construction management, and at the same time I mentor other people. So what's the area that they're the weakest in, or maybe I see an area where their emails are so short that it's too easy for people to miscommunicate, which, as you know, is one of the biggest problems we have, is communication. So I look for redundancy, memorializing conversations. This is very broad, I apologize for talking so long about it, but one of the things that I learned along the way is some people learn really good by listening. Other people have to see it. Mm-hmm. And if you're a person who only teaches one way or the other, you're going to miss a lot of folks. So I think it's important to do verbal and written and try to communicate in both dimensions. And I think you get better communication as a whole for the group. Even though it may seem to somebody who has it that you're now showing them another way, it helps the other folks in the communication process.
Absolutely. And when you're in the role of mentoring somebody else, you're also furthering your own skills. Right. Because whenever we're in a position where we're trying to teach or impart knowledge with somebody else, that is a learning process for the person who's doing that.
I agree.
Yeah. Can you talk about a specific project? Is there a project that's already done that you kind of want to talk through in sort of a story form of, you know, this is how it started out, it encountered these challenges, because all projects have challenges, and this is how we dealt with them, and then this is kind of how it ended up?
You want a project that went well, or you want a project from hell? You know,
that's a great question, and that's one of the things that in this course, one of the exercises that students do is I present them with case studies, and what the students are required to do in the course is frame both projects as both a success and a failure, and to analyze using, they have to choose some project management concepts, and they have to analyze and present an argument. They have to argue both of them as a success and as a failure, and move away from this binary, coming to the conclusion that projects are either failures or successes, because a lot of them aren't.
They're learning experiences. Right, so I have a project in mind that had a lot of success, but also occurred with some miscommunication at the beginning. I came in and took it from someone else when I first arrived, and then during the process of the project construction documentation, there was a code change, and there was also an internal change by the fire marshal about how we were going to handle toxic and flammable gases. So this project had many challenges that really had nothing to do with the researcher, but had an awful lot to do with all of these changes that happened and cost a lot of money to fix. So then I had funding challenges, and then the contractor that we had hired didn't really have a skill set to do the job. The design team that and I'll get more detail if you want. The design team, we had, to make it a little easier to understand, we had a researcher that was using methane and hydrogen gas, and the project came to me pre-designed and ready to go to construction based on 100 psi pressure for the gases, and a bar of pressure is atmospheric pressure about 14.5, and so it turned out that his English wasn't great and the communication wasn't redundant, and he didn't need 100 psi, he needed 100 bar pressure. So it wasn't, someone said 100, and I think there was an assumption about psi. Well, 100 bar is about 1400 psi. So big difference. So the design team that was working on 30 psi didn't have bonding or certification or whatever architects need, liability to design to that high pressure. So not only did we have to change our design team, but even our contractor had to find new subcontractors that could do that kind of work. And so this process is going to take several years, unfortunately, and meanwhile our researcher can't work because he can't do the kinds of research that he does. And so, you think, why do you need that much pressure? They're actually working on ways of bringing crystalline gases at sea in the deep sea, and bringing them up safely. And they're under high pressure, they're crystalline. As they come up, they gas with the lower pressure. And so these experiments have to be done. What can be done? What kind of additives? What kind of chemical makeups? And so in this particular challenge, prior to that, a lot of the flammable gases were just in the lab, and they were piped to the tool. And so in this process, the fire marshal and the codes had changed. Laboratory codes are constantly changing as we accept new IBC code requirements. They now had to be in a flammable gas cabinet, fully fire sprinklered, fully censored, with emergency shutoffs and tied to the fire alarm with a trouble code, that alarm internal, the supervisory that there's a problem internal, and then an actual fire alarm. And so now a project that was going to be, say, a $250,000 project is $750,000. The gas cabinets, instead of being $7,500 or less, the control systems to operate all that end up running about $80,000. And then now you have to involve fire sprinkler people, fire submittals. There's a whole lot of folks that have to get involved. And then at ASU, stop me if I keep going too far, we have multiple different fire alarms and companies that provided them because of all the different years. So maybe a Simpson or a Grinnell or a different, so each building has a different fire system and a different control system. And in this particular building, it also wasn't fire sprinkler. So as part of the upgrading of the project, we put fire sprinklers in the whole building, and this was another part of the code change. We were always supposed to have a fire sprinkler, but it was now becoming more mandatory. There were different limits. So all these things are happening. We're trying to coordinate changing the code review to the type of walls that we have to put in, the fireproofing that we have to put in, the fire sprinklers that we have to put in, the gas cabinets that we have to put in, the connections to the fire alarm, adding new panels to assist the fire alarm. Maybe there was one spot on the fire alarm, but I needed 8 spots for the gas cabinets and the sensing system. So if any gas gets out at the tool, there's a hydrogen sensor, there's a methane sensor. No one knew how to operate the system, so there was a lot of training involved. We had low exhaust alarms. They were changing the air conditioning on the roof, which was at end of life. That kept setting off the alarms. So this project went on and on and on and on with problems. All the piping that used to be above the ceiling now has to be orbitally welded stainless steel below the ceiling. So now we have to do a redesign so that people can get into the ceiling panels to work on the mechanical systems and the lighting, and yet keep the piping under the ceiling for leak detection. So on and on and on and on. And then if you have a low ceiling, like we did in this lab, and I have to cross over the middle of the lab to do some benches with the piping, now I have to have special safety markings so nobody hits the piping that has all the bad gas in it. So that's one of the more complicated projects that started out relatively simple, 100 PSI piping, no gas cabinets, and it morphed into this very complicated, highly technical project.
And when you backtrack that to the misunderstood requirement, it really emphasizes. I mean, there's so much about quality control and right, and doing reviews on, because if you catch that's just like classic project management thing, right? If you catch the mistake in the requirements specification stage before you get into design, right? Like it's so much less costly to catch it there than to catch it way down when you're doing
absolutely
development.
Had we known that instead of 100 PSI it was 1400, he might not have come to this campus. There was no high pressure piping like that on campus. He might have gone to a different location, but instead we'd already picked a location, it was already getting set up, so now we're shoving all these new requirements in a space that really wasn't intended for that. Right. So that's an excellent point.
Yeah, and that it can seem extraordinarily tedious to do requirements reviews, right? To like sit there and because you got to get everybody together, and it's almost like I want to say like a kindergarten classroom or like a pre-kindergarten classroom sort of atmosphere in some of those reviews, right? Like the person who's running the review, and sometimes on big projects they'll bring some outside company who will just do the reviews for you, right? And it does have this really like, are we all in a nursery school classroom here? Because they'll be like, okay, now we're all going to start on page 1 and we're going to read through. Now, does everybody understand? I know, are we all? It's I think our discomfort with being that kind of meticulousness and that kind of ensuring that we're all on the same page.
Right.
Why do we like I even just now I was describing it sort of non-complimentary, right? When I advocate for doing those and how critical those are, and like getting the requirements, like everybody on the same page for the requirements, like why is that such a
I can help with that.
Okay.
Nobody wants to look dumb. You got to, Right. So you got PhDs, you got contractors, all these people are supposed to be, they think they're supposed to be experts. And if I could say one thing about that is, ask the question that is dumb. And don't pretend, who cares? It'll only be dumb once, and it may not be dumb at all. Most of the time, I find 6 people in the room wanted to know the answer, but everybody was afraid to ask it. And so when you mix a kindergarten class with big egos and people who don't want to look stupid and people who don't want to ask a question, what they're doing is they're filling in the blanks and they're making assumptions. And we all know what assumptions are all about, right? And so this happens constantly, and that's why when I started out talking about memorializing a meeting, I go back and I write it up the way I think it ought to be done as the client. And then I get a list of questions that should have been asked in the meeting, because the collaborative two-way conversation is absolutely the best place to do it, and it's the best place to problem solve. And so the trick of the project manager, or whoever's running the meeting, is to create a collaborative, no judgment zone where everybody is welcome and encouraged to ask questions. Don't leave this room without fully understanding your scope of work.